Hello. Good evening. Welcome back to our space of quietude, a place where history unfolds slowly, helping your mind find its own rhythm of rest. Tonight, we dive into the real Old West. Not the Hollywood version, with its heroic cowboys and dramatic duels, but rather the violent and dangerous reality. A reality where survival was never guaranteed. You may think you're strong enough to handle it, but believe me, there's a reason they called this land wild. We're prepared to explore why you, with all the comforts and knowledge of the modern world, might not survive even a single day on this untamed American frontier. It's a legendary chapter of history. But here, we face it without the filter of romance, with the clarity that sleep gently offers us. If you're enjoying this tradition, I would be very grateful for a quick like or even a subscription. It helps our small global community connect through these stories. I'm always curious to know where you're listening from, so feel free to leave a comment with your location. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft and comforting background noise, and let's slowly enter tonight's journey. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the American Old West of the 1870s. Good news, you're about to experience a legendary period of history firsthand. Bad news, your chances of survival have just dropped significantly. The first challenge hits you before you even open your eyes. It's the smell. Not the pleasant, earthy aroma of nature you might expect, but something far more pungent, the stench of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and what is possibly raw sewage hanging heavy in the air. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Old West. Most settlers considered a full wash a monthly luxury, and that's being generous. Some went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, was precious out here, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you needed it for drinking and cooking. As you drag yourself out of bed, which is likely just a mattress stuffed with straw crawling with bugs, you realize how every muscle in your body aches. Life on the frontier of the 1870s involved constant physical labor from dawn to dusk. There were no weekends off, no vacations, and certainly no ergonomic considerations. If you were a farmer, miner, or rancher, your body was your main tool, used until it broke. You may think you've worked hard in your modern life, but frontier work was something entirely different. It was exhausting labor that left even the strongest people permanently hunched and arthritic by around 30 years old. Imagine spending 14 hours plowing fields, carrying water, chopping wood, or working in the depths of a mine shaft. No wonder the average life expectancy was only about 35 years. As you stand up on the dusty floor, you notice the cold in the air. If it's winter, your cabin might be 20 degrees below zero inside. If you had a fireplace, you probably let it go out during the night to save precious fuel. Good luck finding central heating or thermal underwear in this century. And if it's summer, prepare to sweat through every article of clothing you own. There was no escaping the elements in the Old West. Speaking of clothing, forget comfort. Men owned perhaps 2 sets of clothes, rough canvas pants or jeans, and cotton shirts that chafed against the skin. Women wore multiple layers, regardless of temperature. Undershirts, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged in the dirt. Everything was rough, poorly fitted, and barely clean. Those elegant outfits you see in Western movies, pure fiction for the common person. Your stomach rumbles, reminding you it's time for breakfast. It's good that you like beans, biscuits, and coffee, possibly for every meal. The Old West diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Meat, when available, was often preserved with salt or smoke because refrigeration didn't exist. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, the one where your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was common among settlers, despite being easily preventable with modern knowledge. You might think the coffee, at least, would be good. After all, cowboys in movies always seem to have a pot boiling. But what you drink barely resembles what you'd consider coffee. It's typically boiled to the limit of life, bitter beyond belief. And it might include crushed eggshells or even salt to try to reduce the bitterness. Even so, the caffeine will help you face the day, so you drink without complaint. Before heading out, you might want to check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that may have sought shelter during the night. It wasn't uncommon for frontier dwellers to shake out their boots every morning, a habit born from painful experience. One wrong move and you could suffer a venomous bite miles from any medical help. As you step out of your cabin, you immediately become aware of how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, yes, but also relentless. Extreme weather could arise with little warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or droughts could mean death for the unprepared. The sky might be clear now, but that could change in minutes. If you're circulating in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some respects, that's true. In others, however, urban life presents only different and often more concentrated dangers. Old West towns were true hotbeds of disease. Without adequate systems or any knowledge of germ theory, diseases spread rapidly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. A single outbreak could wipe out half a town in a matter of weeks. As you approach, you notice the blatant lack of planning. Many Western towns grew haphazardly. Buildings were constructed wherever convenient, often without proper infrastructure or planning. The streets aren't paved. They're instead dirt trails. When it rains, these trails turn into muddy pits where wagons can sink to the axle. During dry periods, they become bowls of dust. This dust was so thick that sometimes you could barely breathe or see. The smell reaches you again, stronger than in your isolated cabin. Now, horse manure is everywhere. Horses are the main means of transportation, and there were no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, accumulated garbage and animal waste in high-traffic areas could be knee-deep. Flies swarm around you, and you instantly realize why disease spreads so easily here. As you walk down the main street, you pass the saloon, probably one of the town's busiest establishments. Contrary to Hollywood portrayals, saloons weren't glamorous places with swinging doors and elegant pianists. Most were rough, single-room establishments with crude plank counters and basic furniture, and the liquor served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels. It was pure alcohol, often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it an extra kick. A single shot could blind you if you weren't lucky. The saloon represents another deadly aspect of frontier life: violence. These locations were often scenes of deadly confrontations, not due to formal duels or romantic shootouts, but because of drunken arguments that escalated quickly in a heavily armed society. The romanticized shootouts of Western films were rare. Most acts of violence were impulsive, chaotic, and occurred over trivial matters. Bar brawls that escalated to fatal levels, domestic violence, and disputes over land or cattle were far more common than dramatic shootouts on dusty streets. As you walk, you notice that almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind. And while personal protection was a factor, guns were primarily tools for hunting and defense against wildlife, such as bears, wolves, mountain lions, and venomous snakes. Walking unarmed would be foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. It's a constant reminder that, despite the cluster of buildings, civil order here is as fragile as the dusty ground beneath your feet. As you walk through the dusty and muddy streets, you'll notice that almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind. But not for the reasons you might think, based on our movies. While personal protection was certainly a factor, guns were primarily useful. They were used for hunting, protection against wildlife such as bears, wolves, mountain lions, and venomous snakes, and sometimes for signaling. Walking unarmed would be foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. It's surprising to discover that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender their firearms upon entering city limits. The famous shootout at the OK Corral began, in fact, because the Clanton gang refused to comply with this Tombstone law. The image of the skilled gunslinger facing an opponent at high noon is, largely, a Hollywood invention. Quick-draw shootouts in the middle of the street were extremely rare. Most shootouts were ambushes or happened during robberies. Real violence on the frontier was typically sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or justice. Bar brawls that escalated to fatal levels, domestic violence, and disputes over land or cattle. Formal law was sparse and extremely limited in the Old West. The county sheriff was an elected official, responsible for maintaining order in sometimes enormous territories, spanning thousands of square miles. A single sheriff could be the only law representative in a vast area, which made regular patrols impossible. They depended heavily on common citizens' possés during emergencies, creating groups or gangs to pursue crimes or respond to violence. Municipal deputies dealt with law enforcement within town limits, but these positions were often dangerous and poorly paid. The legendary US Marshals from the movies who brought law single-handedly to lawless towns were largely fictional creations. They were few and generally focused on major federal crimes, such as counterfeiting or mail robbery. In many remote areas, where formal law was absent or ineffective, justice was administered through vigilante actions and informal community measures. Lynch mobs were common. Sometimes these groups maintained basic order, but they could easily become vehicles for prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob violence. The concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply here. If you were accused of horse or cattle theft, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset. And this would happen regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. Criminal punishment was notoriously severe by modern standards. Execution was the standard penalty for murder, rape, and sometimes theft, especially of horses or cattle. While prisons existed, they were primitive facilities with high mortality rates due to disease, violence, and harsh conditions. Many communities preferred immediate execution to the cost of long-term incarceration. You realize that, on the frontier, the law is both a source of protection when present and a threat when administered quickly and brutally by vigilante justice. Security here is a luxury, and vulnerability is a constant reality. As you continue your journey, you pass what serves as the local doctor's office. Medical care on the frontier of the 1870s would horrify you. Most doctors practicing in the West had little or no formal training. Your doctor reflected the science of the time, which still relied heavily on theories like humoral balance, which had more in common with medieval medicine than modern practice. In most situations, the first difference you'd notice would be the total absence of professional medical care. Surgical procedures were performed without effective anesthesia, except for alcohol, whiskey, or opium. Patients endured excruciating pain during procedures. Sterilization was virtually unknown or practiced inconsistently. Something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb injuries, performed with saws and knives that might be cleaned but never properly sterilized. If you were injured or became ill on the frontier, your survival often depended more on luck than any medical intervention. Minor injuries could become fatal due to infection. Bone fractures might never heal properly, leaving frontier people with chronic pain and disability. Common treatments included bloodletting, which weakened already sick patients, and the use of mercury compounds, arsenic, and other toxic substances, which often did more harm than good. Laudanum, an opium tincture, was widely used for pain, leading to addiction in many cases. For women, childbirth was an extreme risk. They typically gave birth at home, assisted by a midwife or relatives if available. Without prenatal care, many complications weren't identified until labor was underway. Complications that modern medicine handles routinely, such as hemorrhaging or pelvic presentations, often resulted in the death of the mother, child, or both. Maternal mortality rates on the frontier were approximately 1 death per 100 births, which is more than 100 times higher than in developed countries today. Many women approached each pregnancy knowing it could be their last life experience. Diaries and letters from men of the era frequently mention the painful reality of raising children alone after losing their wives in childbirth. Infant mortality was equally devastating. Approximately 1 in every 4 children died before reaching adulthood. Diseases that modern medicine prevents or treats easily, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, routinely killed or permanently disabled young children. The psychological impact of this constant mortality, where parents expected to lose children and sometimes gave the same name to a subsequent child, is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. The famous phrase, "only the strong survived," had a literal meaning in the Old West. You realize a true threat on the frontier is often invisible, and resides in the vulnerability to life without modern medical security. The story we're exploring is one of resilience and pain, reminding us of the depth of human experience. Let the weight of these past challenges help you release any tension you're still holding. Remember, you're safe now. Your mind is just moving to the past, to learn from it, before returning to the comfort of your present. Allow your breathing to be slow and steady as we prepare for the most difficult part of the journey. If you decided to leave the frontier town behind and travel through the vastness, transportation in the 1870s was an entirely different experience from what you're used to. Although the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, connecting east and west, unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford the fare. Most frontier people traveled on horseback, by wagon, or simply on foot. If you had a horse, consider yourself fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, costing the equivalent of several months' wages for many settlers. Additionally, saddles from the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, but rather for function. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters and sore muscles. And if your horse spooked at a snake or sudden noise, which happened frequently, you could easily be thrown, causing serious injuries, broken bones, or worse, miles from any help. If you couldn't afford a horse, you'd travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers rolling cheerfully across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system. You felt every rock, every rut, and every hole in the trail. The constant jolting caused wagon sickness, similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseated and miserable. Roads, if they existed, were just dirt trails. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink to the axle. During dry periods, dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. Wagons frequently broke down, with wheels cracking or axles breaking miles from the nearest settlement. Perhaps you decided to embark on the 2,000-mile journey to California or Oregon. You joined a wagon train on the famous Oregon Trail. This journey was one of the most dangerous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, it's estimated that 1 in every 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest cemetery. Some historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people died for every mile of the trail. Think about that, a grave every 350 feet for 2,000 miles. The trail was dotted with improvised crosses and stone markers. The number one cause of death on the Oregon Trail was disease. Cholera, a bacterial infection transmitted through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This terrible disease caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluid so rapidly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon convoys could lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases, such as dysentery, typhoid fever, and mountain fever, also claimed countless lives. River crossings presented another deadly challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, but pioneers had to cross considerable rivers. Wagons frequently capsized at these crossings, drowning people and livestock and destroying precious supplies. Accidents were shockingly common. Violent deaths on the trail came primarily from accidents, being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearm accidents were also frequent, as most travelers were inexperienced with guns. The psychological toll of the journey was immense. Families buried children, parents, and partners along the way and had to continue traveling immediately. There was no time for prolonged mourning, as each day of delay meant less chance of crossing the mountains before winter snows made the passes impossible. The constant stress, grief, and physical exertion drove many travelers to mental collapse. Suicide wasn't uncommon among trail migrants. You now feel the weight of the journey. You're not just traveling, you're defying death with every mile. Perhaps you decide to try your luck in the booming mining towns. Stories of fortunes made overnight attracted hundreds of thousands to the west. But mining was, in fact, one of the deadliest professions on the frontier. It was exhausting work. For placer gold mining in streams, You'd spend hours bent over in freezing mountain water, sifting sediments with a pan or sluice. Your hands would crack and bleed from constant exposure to water and rough materials. Your back would ache from the bent position, and after all that effort, you might find a few tiny flakes of gold worth only pennies. In hard rock mining, digging for ore veins in the mountains, dangers multiplied exponentially. Tunnels in frightening rock were drilled without safety equipment or modern engineering knowledge, leading to frequent cave-ins that crushed miners where they stood. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with toxic gases like carbon monoxide, odorless but deadly, suffocating miners without warning. Blasting with black powder or dynamite to break through rock was extremely dangerous. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or lives when charges detonated prematurely or when rock fragments became deadly projectiles. Even avoiding immediate disasters, long-term effects were devastating. Miners constantly inhaled fine rock dust, leading to silicosis. This was a painful lung disease that slowly suffocated its victims. Mercury, used in gold processing, caused neurological damage, tremors, and mental injuries. Those who worked in lead or copper mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, leading to chronic diseases and early death. The mining sector in the 1870s had virtually no safety standards or oversight. Owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, and injuries were considered an expected part of the job. And what was the reward for all these risks? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. Most worked for large mining companies, not independently, earning $2 to $3 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour workday. Studies suggest that store owners, saloon keepers, and prostitutes consistently made more money than the miners themselves. Perhaps you decide to try ranching. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s, driven by demand for beef in eastern cities. This seemed like a healthier alternative. Ranching avoided some of the health risks of mining, but introduced its own dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required significant capital investment. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt, betting their future on suitable weather and market conditions. Nature often had other plans. Droughts could dry up pastures and deplete crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to watch cattle starve or sell them at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds, as happened in the infamous Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887, when up to 90% of cattle in the northern ranges froze or starved to death. Diseases, such as Texas fever and anthrax, could sweep through herds, and there were no effective treatments in the 1870s. While cattle drives weren't romantic adventures, but rather grueling and dangerous undertakings. Cowboys, far from the glamorous figures in movies, were young, poorly paid, and worked 20 hours a day during drives, napping briefly in the saddle. Cattle stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as lightning or a breaking twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable destructive force. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death. Cowboy life had little of the freedom portrayed in Western mythology. They earned about $30 a month for dangerous work. Their diet on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salted pork, and biscuits. Many young men died due to injuries, exposure, or violence. You realize that, whether underground or under the open sky, the price of frontier labor was paid in pain and the constant threat of death. If mining and ranching proved dangerous, perhaps you'd consider farming. After all, growing food, a more fundamental activity, should offer a more stable path of life. The Homestead Act of 1862 beckoned with the promise of 160 acres of free land for anyone who lived on and improved the land for 5 years. It seemed like an incredible chance to build an independent life. But the reality in practice proved far more challenging than the promise. In arid regions, which comprised much of the available land, 160 acres were often insufficient to sustain a family. Traditional farming methods from the East failed in these environments, where rainfall was only a fraction of what pioneers were accustomed to. The first task was to build shelter. In the vast and desolate prairies, where trees were scarce, this meant a sod house. These sod houses were built by cutting and stacking the dense prairie turf. They were dark, damp dwellings that leaked when it rained and crumbled without constant maintenance. Worse still, sod houses harbored insects and snakes, which sought refuge in the dense soil of the walls and roof. Living in these conditions offered little protection against weather extremes. After building shelter came the work of breaking the land for planting. Prairie grass was held together by dense roots that developed over centuries. The soil was extraordinarily difficult to plough with equipment available to most settlers. It could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting, labor so physically demanding that it permanently damaged many farmers' bodies. Once planted, crops faced threats from all directions. Droughts could wither plants before harvest. Torrential rains could destroy seedlings. Early frosts could kill crops just before harvest. And of course, there were the locusts. Grasshoppers descended in biblical clouds, consuming everything green in their path, and sometimes even eating the handles of tools left in the fields. Disease also affected farmers, with particularly devastating consequences. Without hired help and with little community support, a family's illness during crucial planting or harvest periods could mean the difference between survival and starvation. However, the greatest enemy for many wasn't weather or plague, but loneliness. The isolation of frontier farms took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors could be miles away, visited only occasionally. Communication with distant family and friends occurred at the speed of physical transport. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all. This loneliness was particularly difficult for those accustomed to more populated environments. Women, in particular, were often alone for days or weeks, while husbands traveled to get supplies or work. Their diaries frequently mentioned paralyzing loneliness and the psychological strain of having no adult conversations for long periods. This combination of isolation, constant work, and environmental hardships led to what was called prairie madness. This involved severe depression, anxiety, and psychological disorders. Some abandoned their lands and returned east, unable to bear the psychological pressure. Others, unfortunately, became violent toward family members or committed suicide. Frontier life required constant vigilance and psychological resilience in the face of relentless losses and hardships. Survival here wasn't just a matter of physical strength, but mental strength to resist the emptiness and silence that stretched for miles. Throughout your journey, you'd notice something that movies rarely portray accurately: the impressive diversity of people. The Old West wasn't populated only by cowboys and white settlers. It was a true melting pot of cultures, with people from all over the world seeking opportunities or fleeing oppression. Chinese immigrants came in large numbers, working as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families already lived in the Southwest long before it became U.S. territory, often becoming American citizens through territorial acquisition. And black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. Beyond these, European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their cultures and traditions, establishing distinct communities. And of course, stocks of specific Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before others arrived. This diversity, however, didn't mean equality or harmony. Racial violence was a common feature of frontier life. Chinese railroad workers faced brutal discrimination. They were frequently required to take the most dangerous jobs, such as those involving unstable explosives, to blast passages through mountains, and received lower wages than white workers. This discrimination contributed to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major American law to restrict immigration based on nationality. Chinese communities frequently faced riots and mass expulsions when economic conditions worsened. For Mexicans, many of whom became citizens through treaties, the struggle was for land. Many Mexican landowners saw their properties confiscated through legal manipulation, intimidation, or fraud after the Mexican-American War. Spanish-origin water rights systems, effective in arid environments, were replaced by less suitable English approaches. African Americans who moved west sought to escape Southern oppression, but frequently found frontier racism just as entrenched, though different in form. They were needed for ranching and mining, but were often excluded from economic opportunities and social access. Black homesteaders, who established communities in various Western territories, frequently faced organized resistance from white neighbors and discriminatory enforcement of homestead laws. The frontier was a place of enormous power inequalities. While diversity was a strength that introduced diverse skills and perspectives, it was also a source of tension in communities struggling with scarce resources and limited infrastructure. The mythology of the West, focused on white individualism, obscured this complexity and the persistent power imbalances that determined which cultures would be preserved and which would be suppressed. The intersection of these diverse groups, each with their own values, practices, and expectations, created frontier communities far more complex and conflict-filled than later romantic portrayals would suggest. The struggle for land and opportunities was profoundly racial and unequal. For Native American nations, the expansion of white settlement wasn't an opportunity or a journey, but rather nothing less than a catastrophe. The indigenous population of North America, which numbered perhaps 15 million people, was reduced to less than 300,000 by around 1900. Disease, war, forced relocation, and deliberate destruction of their food sources decimated countless tribes and nations. Most shocking was the intentional destruction of their primary resource, the buffalo, or American bison. The buffalo was driven to the brink of extinction. Historians estimate that in the 1700s about 30 to 60 million bison roamed North America. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This devastation wasn't just the result of hunting for food or hides, though that was part of it. It was in fact a deliberate policy encouraged by the US government as a way to deprive Indian tribes of their primary resource. The extermination of the buffalo was a form of environmental warfare, designed to break Indian resistance by eliminating their way of life and forcing them into dependence. General Philip Sheridan, a key figure in the Plains Indian Wars, believed that exterminating the buffalo was the only way to bring peace, order, and allow civilization to advance. For native peoples, expansion represented a cultural apocalypse. The US government systematically pushed Native Americans from their traditional lands to reservations, which were often located in areas with poor soil and few resources. Additionally, treaties were regularly broken. When valuable resources, such as gold or fertile land, were discovered on Indian reservations, treaties were ignored, and natives were required to move again. The reservation system itself represented a form of cultural genocide. The government sought forced assimilation of indigenous peoples. Native children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in boarding schools, with the goal of erasing their cultural identity. The philosophy behind these schools was infamous, summarized in the phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man." In these institutions, children had their hair cut, were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their religions, or maintain their cultural identities. The intergenerational trauma resulting from these policies persists in native communities to this day. Violence between settlers and natives, though portrayed in later films as being unilaterally initiated by natives, was far less common than portrayed in popular culture. In fact, settlers and US military were far more likely to be the aggressors. Many native nations demanded restrictions on newcomers and adapted to new situations. Violence typically erupted after repeated treaty violations, invasion of tribal lands, or deliberate provocations. The tragedy of these cultural threats was intensified by the fact that many native nations possessed sophisticated agricultural systems, complex governance structures, and rich cultural traditions. These cultures could have provided valuable knowledge to European settlers. However, the fundamental difference in worldview about land was insurmountable. Many native groups couldn't conceive of land ownership, just as one can't own air or stars, making territorial treaty negotiations fundamentally problematic from the start. This story isn't about good guys and bad guys, but about systematic devastation of entire civilizations in the name of expansion and progress. Far from the helpless maidens or idealized teachers of Western films, frontier women performed extremely demanding physical labor while navigating restrictive social expectations. On farms and rural properties, women not only handled traditional domestic tasks like cooking, cleaning, childcare, and making clothes, but also worked in the fields, cared for livestock, and defended the home when necessary. Their workday typically began before dawn and ended well after nightfall, with few, if any, days of rest. A frontier woman might plough fields in the morning, help deliver a neighbor's baby at midday, fight off predators threatening livestock in the afternoon, and still need to prepare meals and care for her own children during the evening. The work simply couldn't wait. They continued to work in the fields even when pregnant or just days after childbirth, risking their own health. Many became young widows due to the dangerous nature of frontier life and had to manage farms or businesses alone while raising children. Despite their essential contributions, women had fewer legal rights in most territories and states. They couldn't vote, own property independently if married, or have custody of their children in case of divorce. Domestic violence was often considered a private matter, with little legal assistance available for victims. Maternal mortality was high. Women typically gave birth at home. Without prenatal care, maternal mortality rates on the frontier were approximately 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than today. Many approached each pregnancy knowing it could be their last. For single women, options were severely limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions, though female teachers received significantly less than their male colleagues and were often expected to resign upon marriage. However, some women found greater freedom and more options in the West than they would have in the East. The scarcity of women in Western territories gave them more marriage options and sometimes better treatment, as communities competed to attract and retain female residents. Some territories, like Wyoming and Utah, granted women the right to vote decades before the 19th Amendment, recognizing their essential contribution to frontier development. This political freedom, though not universal, reflected recognition that community survival depended as much on women's work and resilience as on men's work. Others found economic independence running boarding houses, working as nurses or as seamstresses. Even those who worked in marginalized professions, such as prostitutes, often did so out of economic desperation, but risked abuse, venereal diseases, and social ostracism. The mental cost of loneliness and isolation, which often led to prairie madness, was a burden women carried particularly heavily. Their resilience wasn't just physical, but extraordinary mental strength to endure loneliness, constant pain, and predictable loss. The story of frontier women stripped of romance is a powerful testament to human adaptability and determination, an essential force that allowed Old West communities not just to survive, but to create a future. As the day closes once again and darkness deepens, you find yourself reflecting on the difference between the raw reality of the frontier and the mythology that replaced it. You've experienced firsthand why an average person today, accustomed to safety, healthcare, and comfort, likely wouldn't survive even a single day in frontier conditions of the 1870s. They weren't heroes or villains, as popular tales suggest, but rather complex people struggling to survive. People who shaped the West not through romantic duels, but through the quiet heroism of daily persistence against overwhelming adversity. It's important to note that, even in the 1870s, the frontier was already in a state of rapid transformation. The initial phase of settlement, characterized by independent miners and farmers, gave way to more organized corporate development of Western resources. The arrival of railroads, like the transcontinental completed in 1869, catalyzed this change. Railroads drastically reduced travel time from months to weeks and connected isolated regions to national markets. This transportation revolution allowed large-scale exploitation of Western resources for Eastern factories, but often disadvantaged small producers. Independent miners couldn't compete with large mining corporations that brought industrial methods and investment capital. Corporate interests, railroads, mining conglomerates, large landowners exercised enormous influence over territorial and state politics. They often manipulated political processes to secure favorable land grants and government subsidies. The result was that much of the wealth extracted from the Western region went to Eastern and international investors, not to the settlers who took the risks and toil of the frontier. As you reflect on this night in the Old West, one thing becomes clear. Survival here required more than physical strength or skill with weapons. It required an extraordinary capacity to endure suffering, loneliness, and loss. It required the ability to continue when everything seemed hopeless, to rebuild after disaster, and to find purpose amid relentless adversity. The American frontier wasn't a place for the faint of heart or weak of constitution. It was an environment that tested the limits of human endurance in every imaginable way. And while many failed, those who persisted did so not through individual heroism, but through community interdependence, shared resilience, and constant adaptation. You survived your first imaginary day in the Old West, but how many more could you endure? The answer for most modern people is probably not many, and there's no shame in that. Frontier people weren't superhuman. They were simply people who had no choice but to adapt or perish. Now, as this journey comes to an end, allow your breathing to return to its natural rhythm. Feel the comfort of your modern bed, the safety of your home, the peace of knowing you have access to healthcare, clean water, and food. These aren't just comforts, they're privileges that previous generations fought hard to create. Let the stories of the frontier fade gently in your mind, not as a nightmare, but as a reminder of human resilience and the progress that has been achieved. You're safe, you're comfortable, and you're free to rest. Good night. Sleep well. And wake up grateful to live in a time where survival isn't a daily struggle against relentless elements, but a certainty we can assume with confidence.